Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of human history, where a silent enemy shaped the fate of empires. Forget the clash of swords and the roar of the crowd. Behind every grand strategy, every conquering army, lay a far more insidious opponent. To serve in many of history's greatest campaigns, honestly, was to gamble with an invisible enemy more deadly than any arrow or spear. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Long before the first human thought to carve a symbol into a cave wall, before the colossal megafauna roamed continents we would later rename, even before the continents themselves had settled into their familiar wandering dance, there was Plasmodium, a tiny, relentless architect of fever and fatigue, a protozoan parasite so ancient that its primeval roots plunge into the very soil of Earth's deep evolutionary past, reaching back perhaps 100 million years, some suggest even further into the Cretaceous period. Imagine, if you will, the world then. Steaming jungles, vast shallow seas, the air thick with the buzzing of newly evolved insects, and the dominant reptilian forms of the dinosaurs. It was in this primordial soup, in the intricate web of life then unfolding, that this microscopic entity began its slow, methodical ascent, not to dominion, but to an unparalleled mastery of biological persistence. Its journey was not one of conquest in the human sense, but of insidious, quiet adaptation, an exquisite dance of coevolution with its myriad hosts. The earliest ancestors of Plasmodium were likely generalists, perhaps finding their initial homes within the bloodstreams of various cold-blooded creatures, lizards, snakes, perhaps even primitive amphibians. The world was warm, wet, and teeming with life, providing ample opportunity for a parasite that needed a blood mill to complete its intricate life cycle. Picture these ancient reptilian hosts, their scales shimmering under a distant sun, their internal worlds a quiet metaphor of the parasite's silent replication. The beauty, or perhaps the chilling efficiency of Plasmodium, lies in its bipartite life cycle, a sexual phase occurring within an invertebrate host, and an asexual phase within a vertebrate. It was a strategy honed over eons, a testament to the evolutionary pressure cooker that forged such specialized dependencies. For a very long time this was its quiet existence, a series of host jumps and genetic refinements, utterly oblivious to the bipedal mammals that would much later stumble onto the scene and become such an integral, if unwitting, part of its story. The pivotal evolutionary leap, the one that would eventually bring this ancient organism into direct, devastating contact with our own species, involved the acquisition of a new vector, the mosquito. Not just any mosquito, mind you, but the genus Anopheles, whose particular biological quirks and preferences would prove to be an unfortunate boon for the parasite. It's a subtle shift, this transition from one insect lineage to another, but it dramatically altered the trajectory of Plasmodium's spread. As mammalian life diversified and expanded, particularly into primate forms, the parasite followed. From ancient reptiles to birds, from birds to early mammals, and then inexorably into the primate lineage. This was no overnight invasion, but a glacial creep over millions of years, a slow, patient unravelling of genetic possibilities that allowed Plasmodium to colonize new cellular environments, to evade new immune systems, to subtly alter its host's physiology to its own advantage. The molecular clock, that fascinating tool of geneticists, whispers tales of these ancient divergence events, suggesting that the ancestors of modern human malaria parasites may have branched off from those afflicting other primates many millions of years ago, long before anything resembling Homo sapiens walked the earth. Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest of the human malaria parasites, for instance, is now understood to have a remarkably close genetic relationship with Plasmodium reichenoa, a parasite that infects chimpanzees and gorillas, suggesting a relatively recent zoonotic jump, perhaps within the last 10,000 years, or even earlier, from an ape host into human populations. Other human malaria species like P. vivax and P. malariae show even deeper evolutionary roots within our lineage, having perhaps co-evolved with hominids for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That we, with all our technological marvels and self-proclaimed mastery of the planet, are merely the latest and perhaps most significant chapter in a biological narrative that began long before our kind even dreamed of walking upright. This ancient protozoan, perfected over eons, was merely waiting for the right host, the right vector, and the right ecological conditions to unleash its full silent power. And humanity, through its own ingenuity and expansion, unwittingly provided all three. The stage was set then for an encounter that would profoundly shape human history, even if its true nature remained shrouded in mystery for millennia. As the climate shifted, as ice sheets advanced and retreated, as our hominid ancestors began to migrate out of Africa and spread across the globe, they carried with them not only their hopes and their nascent cultures, but also, often unknowingly, the seeds of their own suffering. The great ancient struggle was about to begin, not with a roar, but with the quiet, persistent hum of a mosquito's wings. And so we turn the page of our very long story from the deep, unknowable past to the dawn of recorded human experience, where the spectral hand of malaria begins to leave its indelible mark upon the nascent civilizations of the world. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, sun-baked plains of ancient Egypt, the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, or the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley. Here, where humanity first coalesced into complex societies, where irrigation canals brought life-giving water to arid lands, and where grand monuments rose to touch the heavens, there too did the ancient scourge find fertile ground. It was an unwelcome companion, an unseen assassin lurking in the shadows of progress, its presence often perceived not as a biological entity, but as divine displeasure, a malevolent spirit, or simply the cruel whim of fate. The earliest whispers of malaria's impact on human populations are not found in eloquent prose, for the sophisticated language to describe such an invisible foe did not yet exist. Instead, we must become archaeological detectives, sifting through the dust of millennia, examining the silent testimony of bones and texts for clues. In the marshy deltas of the Nile, where ancient Egyptian civilization flourished, the conditions for Anopheles mosquitoes and by extension Plasmodium were ideal. The annual flooding of the Nile, while essential for agriculture, created vast ephemeral pools of stagnant water, perfect nurseries for the vector, and indeed, the evidence mounts. Paleopathological studies of ancient Egyptian skeletal remains occasionally reveal markers of chronic anemia, such as parotic hyperostosis and cribra orbitalia, conditions that, while not exclusively diagnostic of malaria, are certainly consistent with its long-term effects, especially in children. More compelling still, the remarkable preservation conditions in Egypt have allowed for the analysis of ancient DNA. A groundbreaking study in 2010, for example, identified DNA sequences of Plasmodium falciparum in the mummified remains of Tutankhamun and several other members of his royal family. This discovery not only confirmed the presence of the deadliest malaria parasite in ancient Egypt, but also offered a plausible explanation for the young pharaoh's chronic ill health and perhaps even his premature death, suggesting a hereditary predisposition compounded by repeated malarial infections. The boy king, perhaps, suffered from a double burden, a weakened immune system and a relentless, unseen enemy. From the sun-drenched banks of the Nile, we journey eastward, to the lands between the two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of Mesopotamian civilization. Here, in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon and Assyria, sophisticated irrigation systems transformed arid plains into bountiful agricultural centres. But these very same canals, while feeding millions, also provided permanent breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Ancient cuneiform tablets, while not explicitly detailing malaria as we understand it, speak of debilitating fevers, chills, and enlarged spleens, often attributed to the bane of the swamps or grip of the demons, particularly the demon Lamashtu, often depicted with a lion's head, an ass's teeth and bird's talons, a creature of the marshes and bringer of illness. The connection between disease and swampy environments, though poorly understood in its biological mechanism, was clearly observed. It was a cruel irony, this gift of water bringing both life and a slow, persistent death. The strategic decisions of distant empires, the logistics of their armies, and the health of their populaces were all, whether they knew it or not, intricately linked to the prevalence of these fever-inducing maladies. A general planning a campaign through the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia would unwittingly be leading his troops into a biological ambush far more effective than any human enemy. Further east still, across the vast stretches of ancient Asia, lay the sophisticated urban centres of the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with their meticulous urban planning, advanced sanitation systems, and vast public baths. Yet even here, where human ingenuity seemed to conquer so many environmental challenges, the ecological conditions for malaria were present. The monsoonal climate, the extensive river systems, and the dense urban populations living in close proximity to water sources would have provided ample opportunity for the parasite to thrive. While direct paleopathological evidence from the Indus Valley is less definitive than from Egypt, the epidemiological conditions strongly suggest a significant burden of malarial disease. The movement of goods and peoples along ancient trade routes, from the Indus to Mesopotamia and beyond, would have served as biological highways, inadvertently transporting both the parasite and its vector, ensuring its persistent presence across vast stretches of the ancient world. The perception of these fevers, across all these ancient cultures, was remarkably consistent in its lack of scientific understanding. Disease was often seen as a transgression against the gods, a punishment for sin, or the malevolent work of spirits and demons. Cures often involved incantations, rituals, offerings, and herbal remedies, whose efficacy was more about comfort and faith than biological intervention. The Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text dating to approximately 1550 BCE, meticulously details various fevers, some with periodicity suggestive of malaria, and offers remedies involving everything from onions to honey and beer. Yet, the underlying cause remained a profound mystery, a fundamental limit of their scientific observation. They saw the symptoms, they recognized the patterns, but the invisible thread linking the mosquito's bite to the subsequent illness remained an enigma. They were wrestling with an enemy they could not see, did not understand, and thus could not effectively combat. It was a testament to humanity's resilience that despite this persistent, debilitating threat, these civilizations not only survived but flourished, building empires and laying the foundations for all that would follow. But their history in every sense was being written in the shadow of the fever, a silent, pervasive force shaping demography, economics, and even military strategy, long before anyone understood the delicate, deadly dance between the protozoan, the mosquito, and the human. And so, as the centuries turned and empires rose and fell, the world began to stir with new ideas, new ways of understanding the human condition and the natural world. From the Fertile Crescent and the banks of the Nile, our story now drifts westward, across the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Greece, a land where philosophy bloomed and a radical new approach to medicine began to take root. Here, in the 5th century BCE, a figure of monumental intellect and compassion emerged, one who would forever change the way humanity conceived of health and illness, Hippocrates of Kos, while he, like his predecessors, remained profoundly unaware of the microscopic mechanisms of malaria. His observations were so keen, so systematic, that they laid the groundwork for medical inquiry for the next 2 millennia, providing us with a clearer, though still fundamentally flawed lens through which to view the ancient scourge. Hippocrates, often reverently referred to as the father of medicine, was a true revolutionary. He rejected the prevailing supernatural explanations for disease, arguing instead that illnesses had natural causes stemming from environmental factors, lifestyle and diet. His work, or rather the collection of medical texts attributed to him and his followers, the Hippocratic Corpus, is a treasure trove of clinical observation. Among these texts, Airs, Waters, Places stands out as a pioneering work in environmental medicine and epidemiology, a direct testament to the Greek understanding, or rather their astute observation, of how specific locales and conditions influenced human health. It is here that we find the earliest systematic descriptions of the very fevers we now recognise as malaria. Imagine Hippocrates, or one of his disciples, walking through the marshy lowlands near a Greek palace, perhaps observing the pale, shivering inhabitants, their bellies distended, their eyes yellowed. He noted, with the precision of a master clinician, the association between certain types of fevers and specific environmental conditions. He observed that settlements built near stagnant waters or swampy grounds were invariably afflicted with a higher incidence of illness, particularly the debilitating recurring fevers. The air in such places, he postulated, was heavy, thick, and bad. This concept of bad air, from which the very word malaria, Italian for malaria, would later derive centuries later, was the most advanced epidemiological theory of its time, a brilliant leap of logic that correctly linked cause and effect, even if the true intervening mechanism remained tantalizingly out of reach. They were so close, these ancient Greeks, yet separated by the chasm of microscopy. Hippocrates and his school were particularly adept at classifying the distinct patterns of these intermittent fevers, a classification that resonates even today. He described quartan fevers, which recurred every fourth day, a pattern characteristic of Plasmodium malaria. Then there were the tertian fevers, returning every third day, fitting the profile of Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium falciparum. He also noted quotidian fevers, daily recurrences that could be due to mixed infections or the early stages of other types. These meticulous classifications were not merely academic exercises, they were attempts to understand the rhythm of the disease, to predict its course, and perhaps to find a pattern in its relentless assault that might lead to an effective intervention. He also accurately described other symptoms consistent with malaria: the enlarged spleen, splenomegaly, the yellowing of the skin, jaundice, and the profound weakness and cachexia that followed prolonged illness. His writings reveal a profound empathy for the sick and a rigorous commitment to observational medicine, establishing a tradition that would, over centuries, slowly chip away at the mystery of disease. These early Greek insights weren't limited to mere observation. They led to rudimentary yet remarkably prescient public health measures. While they couldn't drain the swamps with modern machinery, there are accounts of attempts to divert water, to choose settlement sites on higher, drier ground, and to avoid the bad air of marshy areas. The strategic choices of ancient Greek cities, their military campaigns, and their economic endeavours were all subtly yet profoundly influenced by the presence of malaria. The ill-fated Athenian expedition to Syracuse during the Peloponnesian War, for instance, is a classic example. The Athenian troops, accustomed to the healthier climate of Attica, were decimated by disease in the marshy, mosquito-ridden environs of Syracuse, contributing significantly to their ultimate defeat. It was not just spears and shields that decided the fate of empires, but the unseen, insidious enemy carried by a buzzing insect thriving in the very conditions that were considered bad air. The intellectual revolution sparked by Hippocrates was monumental. By moving away from supernatural explanations, he paved the way for a more rational, empirical understanding of disease. His approach fostered a spirit of inquiry that, despite its limitations, represented a fundamental shift in human thought. Yet, the miasma theory, for all its observational brilliance, was a powerful misdirection. It would dominate medical thought for nearly 2,000 years, locking generations of physicians into a framework that, while acknowledging the link between environment and disease, fundamentally misunderstood the precise agent of transmission. The concept of bad air was a persistent shadow, obscuring the true living culprit that buzzed just beyond the range of the naked eye. It took an extraordinary journey through time, a relentless pursuit of knowledge, and the eventual invention of powerful new tools of observation to finally peer into that invisible world and reveal the ancient protozoan and its winged messenger for what they truly were, the orchestrators of one of humanity's oldest and most enduring scourges. The stage was set for a long, arduous, and often devastating education. The story of Rome, as it is so often told, is one of stone and steel, of legions and law. It is a story of visible things, but beneath the paved roads and towering aqueducts, in the shadow of the Colosseum, another power was at work. It was a quieter, more patient force, one that did not need swords or siege engines, it simply needed water. Stagnant water. The Romans called the sickness that rose from these places the febris intermittens, the intermittent fever. They blamed the air, the heavy foul-smelling breath of the swamps. They called it malaria, bad air. A logical conclusion for a people who could chart the stars but could not see the microscopic world. They were brilliant engineers, but they were engineering their own affliction. In draining marshland to create fertile fields, they often created a more perfect world, not for their farmers, but for the Anopheles mosquito. The drainage ditches, the irrigation canals, the shallow pools left behind, each was a perfect, sun-warm nursery, and so the parasite settled into the very heart of the Republic, and later, the Empire. It became a seasonal rhythm, a part of the calendar of Roman life as predictable as the harvest or the games. Writers like Varro and Columella advised gentlemen farmers to build their villas on high ground, away from the swampy lowlands, not for the view, but for their very lives. They knew that in the late summer and early autumn, when the air was thick and still, the fevers would come. The great Pontine marshes, a vast wetland stretching south of Rome, were an infamous source of this pestilence. For centuries, emperors and engineers would try to tame them, a grand struggle against nature that was, in reality, a struggle against an enemy they couldn't name. They would drain a section, declare victory, and a generation later, the water and the fevers would creep back in. The disease etched itself into the demography of Italy. In the countryside, the Roman Campagna, the small landholder, the theoretical backbone of the Republic, was slowly and systematically hollowed out. A farmer struck down by a tertian fever, which recurred every third day, or a quartan fever, recurring every fourth, could not work his fields. He could not bring in the grain, his family would weaken, his debts would grow, and eventually his land would be absorbed into the vast estates, the latifundia, of the wealthy elite, who could afford to live in the city or on breezy hilltops, managing their affairs from a safe distance. This slow-motion economic catastrophe weakened the state from its foundations, creating a reliance on imported grain from healthier provinces like Egypt and North Africa. The bread that fed the Roman mob came from fields free of the Italian fever. The legions, the instrument of Roman power, were not immune. They were masters of logistics, but they could not build a fortification against a mosquito. A Roman commander planning a campaign had to consider the fever season as carefully as he considered enemy numbers or supply lines. To be caught in a low-lying, marshy area in August was to invite disaster. Sickness could cripple a cohort faster than a barbarian charge. The historian Livy speaks of Roman armies being devastated by pestilence, and while he did not have the language to specify malaria, the seasonality and location of these outbreaks are deeply suggestive. It was a constant attritional force bleeding the military of its strength man by man, summer by summer. Garrisons stationed in damp climates, from the river valleys of Britannia to the wetlands along the Danube, would have been slowly drained of healthy soldiers. The greatest army in the world was engaged in a permanent, unwinnable war against an invisible legionary that bred in the very mud where it pitched its camps. As the centuries wore on, the problem worsened. Genetic analysis of remains from Roman cemeteries, like the haunting Cemetery of the Babies at Lugnano in Teverina from the 5th century AD, has found the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite. This graveyard is filled almost exclusively with infants and fetuses, a testament to the disease's brutal efficiency in attacking the most vulnerable, pregnant women and their unborn children. It suggests a population under relentless biological stress. Was this the cause of Rome's fall? No, history is never that simple. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was a complex tapestry of political corruption, economic instability, overexpansion, and external pressures. But malaria was a thread woven deep within that tapestry. It was a slow poison, contributing to depopulation, reducing agricultural output, and weakening the manpower pool for the army. It was a constant drag on the system, an anchor of sickness holding back a society already struggling to stay afloat. When the Visigoths stood at the gates of Rome in 410 AD, they faced a city whose people were not only politically fractured, but had been physically weakened for generations by a spectre rising from the swamps they had never truly conquered. The bad air, it turned out, was the least of their worries. The real threat was in the hum of a wing, too quiet to be heard over the noise of a declining empire. As the Western Roman Empire fractured and dissolved, the grand infrastructure that had held the fevers partially at bay crumbled with it. Aqueducts failed, drainage systems clogged, and roads fell into disrepair. The carefully managed landscapes of the Roman era began to revert. The swamps returned, and with them the fevers intensified their grip on the Italian peninsula. The medieval period saw much of Europe's population retreat to higher ground. Hilltop towns, so characteristic of Italy, were not chosen merely for their defensive advantages against raiding Lombards or Magyars. They were sanctuaries from the pestilential air of the valleys and plains below. Life expectancy in the marshy coastal regions, like the Maremma of Tuscany, was brutally short. The Roman fever became a notorious feature of a visit to the Papal States, a risk that pilgrims and diplomats had to weigh. To spend a summer in Rome was to gamble with one's life. Popes themselves would flee the city for the healthier air of the hills during the dangerous season. The parasite had become a kingmaker, or at least a king-mover, dictating where power could safely reside. This pattern was not confined to Italy. Across medieval Europe, the disease known as the ague, or marsh fever, was a fact of life in any region with standing water. The fens of eastern England, the low-lying river deltas of France, and the wetlands of the Low Countries were all endemic hotspots. Settlement patterns followed the logic of the fever. A village thrived or withered based on its proximity to the mosquito's domain. In England, the writings of the time are filled with references to the ague, a cyclical illness of chills and fever that left its victims weak and sallow. It was so common in certain areas, like the Essex marshes, that it was simply considered part of the local character. Even Shakespeare would use it as a curse in The Tempest, when Caliban wishes upon his tormentors all the infections that the sun sucks up from bogs, fens, flats. It was a universally understood misery. Oliver Cromwell, the man who defeated a king and ruled England as Lord Protector, was himself likely felled in 1658 by a bout of quartan malaria, a foe more resolute than any royalist army. The parasite was also a silent participant in the great conflicts of the age. The Crusades, for instance, were not just a clash of civilizations and armies. They were a clash of immunities. Knights from the cool, damp climes of northern Europe, clad in an impossibly heavy armour, marched into the hot, arid landscapes of the Levant. There, they encountered not only Saracen warriors, but also local strains of malaria to which they had no resistance. The great Crusader castles, like Crac de Chevalier, were masterpieces of military architecture, but they offered no defence against the bite of a mosquito in a nearby stream. Armies were ravaged by disease before they even reached the battlefield. The failure of the Second Crusade and the immense difficulties faced by the Third, led by Richard the Lionheart, were compounded by rampant sickness that swept through the European camps. It was a logistical nightmare. The Crusaders' greatest enemy was not always the soldier they could see, but the parasite they could not. Further east, along the sprawling trade routes that connected empires, the parasite travelled too. It was a constant presence in the Byzantine Empire, a shadow in the golden city of Constantinople. It flourished in the irrigated agricultural heartlands of the Islamic caliphates in Mesopotamia and Persia. It was endemic across India and Southeast Asia, shaping the lives of millions within the great empires of the Mughals and the Ming. It was an ancient, established part of the ecological balance, a check on populations that was as powerful as any famine or war. In Africa, south of the Sahara, Plasmodium falciparum had coexisted with human populations for millennia, driving the evolution of genetic defences like the sickle cell trait. It was a brutal but stable relationship. The parasite was a permanent feature of the landscape, a silent partner in the rise and fall of kingdoms from Ghana to Great Zimbabwe. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern era, the age of discovery began to stitch the globe together with shipping lanes. This newfound connectivity was a triumph of human ingenuity, but it was also a perfect delivery system for disease. Ships, with their open water casks, provided ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes. A single infected sailor could introduce the parasite to a port half a world away. Malaria began to move with a new global velocity. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was engaged in a monumental struggle, not only for independence from Spain, but against the sea itself. The Dutch became masters of land reclamation, building dikes and pumping water to create their famous polders. It was an engineering marvel, but in doing so they created vast new territories of brackish, slow-moving water, a paradise for Anopheles mosquitoes. The Dutch ague became infamous, a debilitating fever that plagued the new lands they had fought so hard to win from the waves. They had conquered the sea, only to find they had created a battlefield for a much smaller foe. Humanity was beginning to connect the world, but in doing so it was creating new highways for its oldest parasitic companion, preparing the stage for its most devastating introduction to a continent that had, until then, been entirely free of its presence. The parasite was about to discover a new world. The Americas before 1492 were a world apart. They possessed their own unique tapestry of life, their own complex human societies, and their own diseases. But the specific parasite that causes human malaria, Plasmodium, was absent. The local mosquito species of the genus Anopheles were present, perfectly capable of transmitting the disease, but they were waiting unknowingly for their deadly cargo to arrive. They were the lock. Europe and Africa were about to provide the key. The Columbian Exchange is often discussed in terms of the crops and animals that crossed the Atlantic, a grand transfer of life that remade diets and economies on both sides. But the most consequential exchange was microbial. Europeans brought with them smallpox, measles and influenza, which ripped through indigenous populations with an apocalyptic fury, and they brought Plasmodium vivax, the parasite responsible for the less deadly, but still debilitating, form of relapsing malaria common in Europe. It arrived in the blood of the first colonists, soldiers and missionaries who settled in places like Jamestown along the coast of Brazil, but the true catastrophe arrived in the holds of slave ships. The transatlantic slave trade, that brutal engine of coerced migration, was also the primary vector for the introduction of Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal of the malaria parasites, into the Western Hemisphere. Enslaved people captured in Western Central Africa, where falciparum was hyperendemic, carried the parasite in their blood across the Middle Passage. Upon arrival in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the coastal plains of North America, they were bitten by the local Anopheles mosquitoes. The parasite found a new home. The transmission cycle began. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had absolutely no evolutionary history with the parasite, the result was catastrophic. Having already been decimated by waves of smallpox and other Eurasian diseases, they now faced a new, insidious killer. It swept through communities in the hot, humid lowlands, causing devastating epidemics that further cleared the land for European settlement. Malaria acted as an invisible ally to the colonists, a biological weapon they did not even know they were wielding. It helped to empty a continent. This new ecological reality soon created a grim and horrifying economic logic that would shape the Americas for centuries. In the tropical and subtropical regions, ideal for growing cash crops like sugar and rice, European colonists quickly discovered that they and their indentured servants died in appalling numbers from the fevers that bloomed every summer. They called this period of adjustment seasoning, a gentle euphemism for a brutal process of disease and death. Many did not survive it, but it was observed that enslaved Africans, while they also suffered and died, often survived these seasoning periods at higher rates than Europeans. The reason was genetics. Millennia of coevolution with Plasmodium falciparum in Africa had led to the prevalence of inherited blood conditions, most notably the sickle cell trait. Carrying one copy of the sickle cell gene confers significant protection against severe malaria. It is a textbook example of natural selection in action. Plantation owners in places like Barbados, Jamaica, and the coastal Carolinas were not geneticists, but they were ruthless accountants of human life and labour. They saw the pattern. They concluded, in their racist calculus, that Africans were constitutionally better suited for labour in these deadly environments. The parasite itself thus became a justification for the expansion and entrenchment of chattel slavery. It created a labour system based on a perceived and tragically real biological advantage in surviving a disease environment that Europeans themselves had helped to create. Malaria became the silent overseer of the plantation economy. Nowhere was this more stark than in the Low Country of South Carolina. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, this region was transformed into a vast rice-producing kingdom. The technology for cultivating rice was brought by enslaved West Africans who had grown the crop for generations, but the very method of cultivation, the flooding of vast paddies, created an enormous, perfect breeding ground for Anopheles mosquitoes right next to the living quarters of the enslaved workforce. The result was an annual explosion of falciparum malaria. It was so predictable and so deadly that it created a unique social geography. The wealthy white planter class developed a pattern of seasonal escape. As the first mosquitoes began to hum in late spring, they would flee their plantations for the relatively healthier sea breezes of cities like Charleston or for homes in the cooler backcountry. They would remain there until the first frost of autumn killed the mosquitoes, leaving their plantations to be run by a handful of overseers and the enslaved population, who were forced to endure the full force of the sickly season. The landscape of the American South was literally shaped by the terror of the mosquito. The grand townhouses of Charleston were monuments built on a foundation of rice, slavery, and the seasonal avoidance of malaria. The disease dictated social calendars, architecture, and the very structure of a brutal and exploitable society. The parasite had remade the New World in its own image, creating zones of death that were perversely also zones of immense wealth for a select few. It entrenched racial hierarchies and provided a grim biological rationale for the largest forced migration in human history. Yet, even as the disease was helping to build empires of sugar and rice, a glimmer of a counterweapon was emerging from the very continent so afflicted by the parasite's arrival. In the mountains of Peru, the native Quechua people had long known of the medicinal properties of the bark of a particular tree, the cinchona. They used it to treat fevers. In the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries learned of this remedy. The powdered bark, which came to be known as Jesuit's powder or Peruvian bark, was found to be astonishingly effective at stopping the relentless cycle of malarial fevers. The legend, though likely apocryphal, tells of the Countess of Chinchon, the wife of the Spanish Viceroy of Peru, being cured of a fever by the bark in the 1630s. The botanist Linnaeus would later name the tree cinchona in her honour. The active ingredient, quinine, would not be isolated for another 200 years, but the bark itself was a revelation. It was the first effective chemical treatment for a major infectious disease, but its distribution was fraught with the politics of empire. The Spanish tried to monopolize the supply of the precious bark from their South American colonies, the secret of which tree produced the best bark was jealously guarded. The cure became a tool of statecraft and commerce. For the first time, humanity had found a chink in the armour of its ancient adversary. It was a discovery born in the Andes, a world away from the African origins of the deadliest parasite, but it would change the balance of power in the long, slow war against the fever. A war that was about to enter a new, scientific, and truly global phase. For centuries, the shivering sickness had been a feature of the landscape, an elemental force like the wind or the rain. It was managed, not cured. Fevers were endured, not broken. But across the vast Atlantic, in the thin, cold air of the Andes Mountains, a different story was being told, whispered among the Quechua people. They knew of a tree, a tall, slender tree, with reddish bark and leaves that shimmered in the high-altitude sun. They called it quina quina, the bark of barks. They knew that when this bark was ground into a powder and mixed with water, it could quell the violent shudders of the fever. It was a knowledge held close, a local remedy for a local affliction. This secret could not last. The Spanish, in their quest for golden souls, had brought their own diseases, but had also stumbled into landscapes with unfamiliar ailments. It was the Jesuit missionaries, meticulous observers and chroniclers, who first took serious note of this fever tree. The local traditions were studied, the bark was tested, and its remarkable power was confirmed. The exact story of its transmission to Europe is shrouded in legend, the most famous being that of the Countess of Chinchon, the wife of the Spanish Viceroy of Peru. In the 1630s, the story goes, she was struck down by a terrifying fever, her life hanging by a thread. A local official, knowing of the native remedy, prescribed the bitter powder. She drank it, and the fever broke. Her recovery was deemed miraculous. In her honour, the botanist Linnaeus would later name the tree's genus Cinchona. It's a wonderful tale, though likely untrue. The tree is rarely so neat. The truth is probably more mundane, a gradual transfer of knowledge through the methodical continent-spanning network of the Jesuit order. The bark arrived in Europe not as a medicine, but as a rumour, a curiosity from the New World. It was called Peruvian bark, or more commonly Jesuits' powder, and it was met with deep suspicion. This was the era of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. In Protestant countries like England, a powder promoted by Catholics, and Jesuits no less, was seen as a papist plot, a poison masquerading as a panacea. A patient might be cured of their ague, the thinking went, only to find their soul damned. But the fevers did not care for theology. They continued their relentless cycles, and desperation is a powerful antidote to prejudice. The powder worked, and its efficacy was difficult to ignore. Its reputation was cemented not by a physician, but by an opportunist, a clever charlatan named Robert Talbot. He was an apothecary's apprentice who set up shop in London, claiming to have a secret cure for the ague. His cure was, of course, Jesuits' powder, which he disguised by mixing it with wine and other flavourings. He marketed it brilliantly, and his fame grew. In 1678, King Charles II himself, the Merry Monarch, was afflicted with a severe malarial fever. His royal physicians, with their bleedings and purges, were helpless. In desperation they called for Talbot. He administered his secret potion, and the king recovered. Talbot was knighted and given a royal pension, on the condition that he never reveal the formula. It was a state secret. Only after Talbot's death was his little book published, revealing the secret to be nothing more than the bark of the cinchona tree. The endorsement of a king, however, was enough. The powder's legitimacy was secured. Demand exploded. Suddenly, this reddish-brown powder from a remote mountain range in South America was one of the most valuable commodities in the world. The governments of Peru and Bolivia, realizing they held a global monopoly, tried to control its trade, imposing strict regulations and export limits. But the cinchona forests were vast, and the prize was too great. The bark became the subject of smuggling, espionage, and a new kind of colonialism, biopiracy. European powers, particularly the British and the Dutch, understood that their imperial ambitions depended on this bark. To build empires in the tropics, in Africa and Asia, they needed to protect their soldiers, their administrators, their engineers from the ever-present threat of malaria. The fevers of the white man's grave in West Africa or the swampy plains of India could halt an army more effectively than any human foe. The cinchona bark was not just a medicine, it was a strategic military asset, and so expeditions were launched, not to conquer land, but to steal a plant. In the 1850s and 60s, men like the British explorer Clements Markham and the Dutch botanist Justus Haskell undertook perilous journeys into the Andes. They bribed officials, evaded patrols, and carefully collected cinchona seeds and seedlings. Markham's expedition was a near disaster, with most of his delicate plants dying on the long voyage back. The Dutch were more successful. They managed to establish vast, efficient plantations on the fertile volcanic slopes of their colony in Java. The British eventually followed suit, creating their own plantations in India and Ceylon. The result was a revolution. The price of the bark and its purified alkaloid, quinine, which was isolated by French chemists in 1820, plummeted. It was no longer a rare luxury for kings and aristocrats. It could be mass-produced. It could be issued as a standard ration to entire armies. British officials and soldiers in India were ordered to take a regular prophylactic dose of quinine powder. The taste was horrendously bitter, so they began mixing it with soda water and sugar to make it palatable. They then added a splash of gin to make the daily ritual a little more pleasant. And just like that, the gin and tonic was born, a cocktail of the empire, the bitter taste of conquest masked by botanicals and bubbles. Quinine didn't just treat the sick, it allowed healthy Europeans to march into the heart of the world's most malarious regions. It was the chemical key that unlocked continents. The bark that had once belonged to the Quechua people now belonged to the world, and it was being used to build the very empires that would subjugate so many. The bark had bitten back, but not in the way anyone had expected. For all its miraculous power, quinine was a weapon used in the dark. It fought an enemy that no one had ever seen. The prevailing theory of the disease was still rooted in the ancient world. It was malaria, bad air, a poisonous miasma that rose from swamps and marshes, a foul vapour that seeped into the body and corrupted the humours. Draining swamps sometimes helped, but no one truly understood why. The fever was a ghost, an invisible force in the atmosphere. Quinine could exorcise it, but it couldn't explain it. The explanation would not come from a grand theory or a philosophical treatise. It would come from the quiet, patient gaze of a man staring through a brass tube into a world previously unseen. The year is 1880. The place, a military hospital in Constantine, a city in French-occupied Algeria. The air is thick with heat and the smell of antiseptic. The wards are filled with young French soldiers, their bodies racked by the telltale cycle of chills, fever, and drenching sweats. An army surgeon named Charles-Louis Alphonse Laviren moves among them. He is a methodical, unassuming man, frustrated by his inability to do more than dispense quinine and watch the fevers run their course. He is a child of the new scientific age, an age of microscopes and germ theory, and he cannot accept that this powerful illness is caused by something as vague as bad air. The cause, he reasons, must be physical. It must be something in the blood. So he begins to look. Day after day he takes blood samples from his patients. He places a tiny drop on a glass slide, presses a thin cover slip over it, and places it on the stage of his simple microscope. He adjusts the mirror to catch the light, squints into the eyepiece, and turns the brass knob to bring the sample into focus. For hours, he stares at the shimmering, ghostly discs of red blood cells. Most of the time he sees nothing out of the ordinary. It is tedious, frustrating, eye-straining work. But on November 6, 1880, he sees something different. In the blood of a soldier in the midst of a feverish paroxysm, he notices peculiar dark spots, little pigmented crescents and spheres on the red blood cells. He has seen these before, but then, as he watches, he sees something that makes him hold his breath. From the side of one of the spheres, several long whip-like filaments suddenly extend, and they are moving. They are thrashing wildly, lashing about in the plasma. It is unmistakable. It is alive. He had found it. He had found the parasite. This was not a vapour. This was not a miasma. This was a living organism, a microscopic creature that was invading and destroying the very blood of his patients. He called it Oscillaria malaria. He rushed to publish his findings, but the medical establishment was sceptical. A French army doctor in a colonial backwater claiming to have found the cause of a disease that had baffled humanity for millennia? It seemed preposterous. Many dismissed his moving filaments as artifacts of dying blood cells, but Leverin was certain he had seen the enemy. His discovery, though initially doubted, opened the floodgates. Scientists across Europe, particularly in Italy, turned their microscopes to the blood of malaria patients. A group of Italian researchers, Ettore Marchiafava, Angelo Celli and Camillo Golgi, confirmed and expanded upon Leverin's work. It was Golgi who made the next crucial observation. He realised that the patient's fever cycles, the predictable rise and fall of their temperature every 2 or 3 days, corresponded perfectly with the life cycle of the parasite in the blood. The fevers spiked precisely when a generation of the parasites ruptured the red blood cells in unison, releasing a fresh wave of invaders to infect more cells. He also identified that there were at least 2 different species of the parasite, one causing a fever every 3rd day, tertian malaria, and another causing a fever every 4th day, quartan malaria. The ancient puzzle of the periodic fevers was finally solved. The disease now had a name, Plasmodium, and a clear, observable pathology. But a giant piece of the puzzle was still missing. A fundamental question remained unanswered. How did the parasite get from one person to another? How did it enter the bloodstream in the first place? The bad air theory, though wounded, was not yet dead. Others suspected contaminated drinking water, and some, a few prescient thinkers, pointed to a far more likely culprit, the one creature that seemed to be a constant companion to the disease, the mosquito. The idea was not entirely new. Folk wisdom in malarious regions had long associated the insects with the fever, but association is not causation, and science demanded proof. The proof would come from another medical officer working in a distant corner of a vast empire. His name was Ronald Ross. He was a British surgeon in the Indian Medical Service, stationed in the sweltering heat of Secunderabad in the 1890s. Ross was a polymath, a man of restless intelligence who wrote poetry, plays and novels in his spare time. He was also a brilliant and doggedly persistent researcher. He became obsessed with Leverin's parasite and the mosquito hypothesis. His work was a masterpiece of grueling, methodical labour. He needed to prove a chain of events, that a specific type of mosquito would bite a person with malaria, that the parasite would develop inside that mosquito, and that the mosquito could then transmit the developed parasite to a healthy person. He began by trying to infect the common grey and brindle mosquitoes, the ones that buzzed around his barracks in clouds. For 2 years he dissected thousands of them under his microscope, searching for any sign of the Plasmodium parasite. He found nothing. It was maddening, thankless work performed in the oppressive Indian heat, his uniform soaked with sweat, his eyes aching from the microscope. He called it his war with the mosquito. Then, in August of 1897, he had a breakthrough. He had managed to procure a few specimens of a different kind of mosquito, one with dappled wings, that his assistant had collected from the walls of the hospital. He called them dappled-winged, or brindled mosquitoes. They belonged to the genus Anopheles. He allowed them to feed on a malaria patient named Hussein Khan. Then, day by day, he dissected the few that survived. On the 20th of August, a date he would later call Mosquito Day, he was examining the stomach tissue of the very last of these mosquitoes, and there, on the outer wall of the insect's stomach, he saw them. Tiny, circular, pigmented cysts. They were unmistakable. They were the malarial parasite growing and developing within the mosquito's body. He knew in that instant that he had found the link. He had found the vector. Overcome with emotion, he went home and wrote a poem. "I know this little thing a myriad men will save," he wrote. "O death, where is thy sting, thy victory, O grave?" Ross was transferred to Calcutta, where he was no longer allowed to work with human patients. Undeterred, he switched to studying avian malaria in sparrows and larks. There he worked out the parasite's entire life cycle, showing how it migrated from the mosquito's gut to its salivary glands, positioning itself to be injected into a new host with the next bite. In Italy, a team led by Giovanni Battista Grassi quickly confirmed Ross's findings in humans, proving conclusively that only the female Anopheles mosquito could transmit human malaria. The mystery was solved. The enemy had a face. Plasmodium. And its accomplice, its delivery system, had been identified. The Anopheles mosquito. It was one of the greatest triumphs of medical science. The knowledge was now in hand. The ghost of miasma had been banished by the hard light of the microscope. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. How could this new understanding be deployed, not just to treat the sick, but to stop the sickness from ever starting? The first great test of this new paradigm would take place not in a laboratory or a hospital, but in a vast, muddy, rain-soaked ditch being dug across the spine of a continent. Long before the microscopes of Laveran and Ross revealed the true nature of the enemy, an old dream was being revived. The dream of a canal, a waterway that would sever North and South America and unite the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The French, emboldened by their recent triumph at the Suez Canal, were the first to try. In 1881, the celebrated diplomat and developer Ferdinand de Lesseps, the hero of Suez, arrived in Panama to lead the charge. He was a man of immense charisma and vision, but he was leading his men into an ambush. Their enemy was not the jungle's suffocating heat, nor the torrential rains that turned the ground to a liquid morass, nor even the monumental engineering challenge of cutting through the Culebra Mountains. Their true enemy was microscopic, and it was waiting for them in the blood of the local population and in the bodies of the mosquitoes that swarmed in the billions. The French effort was an unmitigated catastrophe. They came with the finest engineering minds and the most advanced machinery of the age, but they were fighting a 19th century war with medieval medical knowledge. They believed the fevers that began to strike down their workers were caused by miasma, the foul air rising from the swamps and freshly dug earth. They built their hospitals in beautiful locations with pleasant breezes, like Ancon Hill, which happened to be prime breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The hospital itself became a primary vector of disease. The legs of the hospital beds were placed in little pans of water to deter ants, and these pans became perfect nurseries for the larvae of Aedes aegypti, the mosquito that carries yellow fever. Nurses would move from the yellow fever ward to the malaria ward, unknowingly carrying infected mosquitoes on their clothing. The death toll was apocalyptic. Workers were dying at a rate that is still difficult to comprehend. Young French engineers, fresh from Paris, would arrive full of ambition and be dead within a month. The project consumed men as voraciously as its steam shovels consumed earth. It is estimated that over 20,000 labourers died during the French attempt. The saying on the isthmus was that a life had been lost for every railroad tie laid by the Panama Railway Company. The project hemorrhaged money and men. By 1889, de Lesseps's company was bankrupt, the project was abandoned, and the dream of a canal lay rusting in the jungle, drowned in a sea of mud, scandal, and disease. Malaria and yellow fever had defeated one of the great powers of Europe. When the Americans took over the project in 1904, they came armed with more than just a bigger budget and bigger steam shovels. They came armed with the knowledge of Laveran and Ross. They knew the enemy. President Theodore Roosevelt knew that the canal's success or failure would hinge not on engineering, but on sanitation, and he had just the man for the job, Colonel William C. Gorgas, a doctor in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Gorgas was a quiet, methodical man who had already achieved the seemingly impossible. A few years earlier, in Havana, Cuba, following the Spanish-American War, he had applied the new mosquito theory to eliminate yellow fever from the city, a feat that had stunned the medical world. He knew exactly what needed to be done in Panama, but first he had to fight a war on two fronts, one against the mosquito, and another against the stubborn skepticism of the American engineers and bureaucrats who were his bosses. The Isthmian Canal Commission, the body in charge of the project, was composed of engineers. They believed in dynamite and steel, not in what they called Gorgas's mosquito theories. They saw his requests for screens, for fumigation chemicals, for an army of sanitation workers, as a colossal waste of money. John Findlay Wallace, the first chief engineer, openly ridiculed Gorgas, cutting his budgets and denying his requests. For the first year, Gorgas was hamstrung, and the diseases began to rage just as they had for the French. A yellow fever epidemic broke out, panic spread, and the entire project once again teetered on the brink of collapse. It was only when Roosevelt himself intervened, spurred on by reports of the impending disaster, that Gorgas was given the authority and the resources he needed. He was made a member of the commission and given a blank cheque. And with that, Gorgas unleashed the most ambitious, systematic and militaristic public health campaign the world had ever seen. The canal zone became a laboratory 10 miles wide and 50 miles long. It was a total war against two species of insect. The scale of the operation was staggering. Gorgas divided the canal zone into districts, each with its own sanitation officer. An army of 4,000 workers was mobilised. Their mission was simple: to make it impossible for the Anopheles and Aedes aegypti mosquitoes to breed. Swamps and marshes were drained. Thousands of acres of brush and grass were cut back to eliminate places where adult mosquitoes could rest. Every body of standing water, from vast lakes to small puddles, was sprayed with a film of oil and kerosene once a week to suffocate the larvae. Sanitation brigades, known as the mosquito squads, went house to house in the cities of Colon and Panama City. They screened every window and door. They sealed every cistern and covered every water barrel. They fumigated homes where fever cases were reported, burning pyrethrum powder to kill any adult mosquitoes inside. They laid new pipes to provide running water to the cities, eliminating the need for the rainwater barrels that served as mosquito nurseries. They even dispatched larvicide squads to place tiny fish in water sources to eat the larvae. Every single worker on the canal project was given quinine as a prophylactic. It was dispensed in clinics and by quinine dispensers who walked along the work sites. It was a multi-pronged attack. Kill the adults, kill the larvae, and medicate the human host to prevent the parasite from multiplying. It was a war of relentless, systematic attrition. The results were swift and dramatic. Within a year, yellow fever was completely eradicated from the canal zone. The last case was reported in November 1905. The malaria rates, a more stubborn problem due to the Anopheles mosquitoes' jungle habitat, were driven down by 90%. The wards of the Ancon Hospital, once overflowing with dying men, were now eerily quiet. The workforce stabilised. Morale soared. The great earth movers could now work unimpeded by the fevers. William Gorgas had not moved a single shovelful of dirt, but he, more than any engineer, made the completion of the Panama Canal possible. He had demonstrated to the world that the new science of tropical medicine was not an abstract theory, but a powerful practical tool. The Panama Canal, which opened in 1914, was a monument not only to engineering might, but to the quiet, revolutionary power of a microscope and a mosquito net. A victory had been won, not just over a mountain range, but over an ancient parasite and its tiny winged messenger. And so the world plunged into war. Twice, a war of steel and a war of blood. But underneath the roar of artillery and the drone of bombers, a much older, quieter conflict continued unabated. a conflict fought not in the trenches or the skies, but in the capillaries and the liver cells of millions of soldiers. In the First World War, the parasite revealed its strategic genius on the forgotten fronts. Consider the Macedonian front, in and around the Greek port of Salonika. Here, British and French armies were sent to aid Serbia, but found themselves bogged down, facing not only the Bulgarian army but a far more relentless foe. The swampy Vardar River valley was a paradise for the Anopheles superpictus, mosquito. Malaria bloomed. The French called the fever-addled port the birdcage of Salonika, and the British wryly named their local military newspaper the Balkan News. A more honest title would have been the Quinine Gazette. By 1916, the French army had over 30,000 men in the hospital with malaria. By 1917, the British were evacuating 1,000 men a week. At its peak, the British force of around 120,000 men reported over 160,000 hospital admissions for malaria. Think about that number. The same men cycling in and out of the fever wards, their bodies racked with chills, their minds clouded, their fighting strength utterly compromised. Generals planned offensives that simply evaporated, not from enemy fire, but from a collective synchronized fever that laid entire battalions low. The war in Salonika wasn't a war of movement, it was a war of attrition waged by a protozoan. Quinine was the only weapon, and it was a logistical nightmare. Shipping lanes were threatened by U-boats, supplies were erratic, and compliance among the troops was poor. The parasite held the line. A similar story unfolded in the sweltering heat of the East African campaign, where a small, brilliant German force under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck held off a vastly larger Allied army for 4 years. His greatest ally was not German command, but the local ecosystem. His troops had some acquired immunity. The incoming British, South African and Indian soldiers did not. Malaria and dysentery inflicted casualties at a rate that no machine gun ever could. For every soldier lost in combat, dozens more were lost to disease. Von Lettow-Vorbeck understood this. He didn't have to defeat the Allied army, he just had to lead them on a chase through mosquito-infested territory and let nature do the rest. The parasite was a silent partner in his legendary guerrilla campaign. But these were mere dress rehearsals. The Second World War would be the parasite's grandest stage. The conflict became truly global, throwing millions of young men from temperate climates into the world's most malarious hot zones. The Pacific Theatre in particular was not just a battle against the Empire of Japan, it was a battle against Plasmodium falciparum. When American Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal in August 1942, they stepped into one of the most efficient malaria transmission zones on Earth. The island was a humid, swampy hell of kunai grass and dense jungle, crisscrossed with stagnant streams. It was perfect. The Japanese, who had been there for months, were already suffering. The Americans were entirely unprepared. At first, the fighting was savage, a desperate struggle for an airfield. But soon, a second invisible enemy began its assault. Men on patrol would suddenly collapse, shivering violently. Sentries in foxholes would fall into delirious sleeps. Platoons would report for duty at half strength, their men too weak to stand. They called it the Solomon Shakes. During the brutal 6-month campaign, US forces suffered over 60,000 cases of malaria. For every man wounded by a bullet or a shell fragment, 5 were felled by the bite of a mosquito. The malaria casualty rate reached an astonishing 320 per 1,000 men per week. It was a biological catastrophe that threatened to derail the entire Allied offensive in the Pacific. General Alexander Patch, the US Army commander who took over on the island, famously reported to his superiors, "The enemy is not the Japanese, but the mosquito." It was the same story for the Australians fighting along the Kokoda Track in New Guinea, a muddy, mountainous trail that was less a path and more a suggestion of one. Here, young men from Melbourne and Sydney fought a tenacious Japanese enemy in unimaginable conditions. And here too, malaria was the great equaliser. The disease tore through the Australian ranks. The evacuation of a single sick soldier was a monumental task, requiring a team of 8 men to carry a stretcher through the suffocating jungle. An army hemorrhaging its strength not to the enemy, but to a fever. The parasite didn't care about flags or ideologies. It simply found a warm-blooded host and went to work. This biological crisis was compounded by a strategic one. In early 1942, with stunning speed, Japan conquered the Dutch East Indies, specifically the island of Java. And on Java were the world's largest and most productive plantations of cinchona trees. In one swift move, Japan had seized 95% of the global quinine supply. The Allies were cut off from their only effective anti-malarial drug. It was a strategic disaster on par with the loss of a fleet. An army cannot fight if it cannot stand. A navy cannot sail if its sailors are consumed by fever. The entire war effort in the Pacific and in the China-Burma-India theatre was suddenly at risk of collapse. The race was on, a desperate, frantic search for a synthetic substitute. The solution, ironically, came from the enemy. German chemists at Bayer, back in the 1930s, had developed a synthetic compound they called atabrine. It was a bitter, bright yellow pill. When the war began, American and British scientists reverse-engineered it and began a massive production campaign. Atabrine became the bitter yellow hope of the Allied armies, but it was a deeply flawed saviour. It had vile side effects, nausea, headaches, and most famously, it turned the skin a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Soldiers hated it. They thought it made them sterile or impotent. They would pretend to swallow their daily dose only to spit it out when the medical officer turned away. This lack of compliance meant malaria rates remained stubbornly high. Command had to resort to propaganda and threats. Posters went up, no atabrine, no souvenirs. In some units, soldiers had to urinate into a cup and the liquid was inspected under a black light. Atabrine fluoresces, so if your urine didn't glow, you faced disciplinary action. Slowly, reluctantly, what was called atabrine discipline took hold and malaria rates began to fall. But an even better weapon was on the horizon. Another German invention from the 1930s called Resocin had been dismissed by its creators as too toxic. During the desperate wartime research program in the United States, scientists re-examined it. They discovered that the Germans had been wrong. This drug, which the Americans would rename chloroquine, was a marvel. It was far more effective than quinine or atabrine, faster acting, and had far fewer side effects. It didn't turn your skin yellow. It was close to a miracle drug. By the end of the war, chloroquine was flowing to the front lines, a testament to the immense power of coordinated, state-funded science under the pressure of total war. The parasite had nearly defeated entire armies, but in doing so it had inadvertently spurred the creation of the very weapons that would be used to try and wipe it from the face of the earth. The stage was set for a new kind of war. A war of eradication. The guns of the Second World War fell silent, but the laboratories did not. Humanity emerged from the conflict armed with a newfound, almost terrifying confidence in its own technological prowess. We had split the atom, we had developed radar, jet engines and penicillin, and in the fight against malaria, we now possessed 2 weapons that seemed, for a moment, to be infallible. We had chloroquine, the perfect, fast-acting cure, and we had a new discovery, a chemical miracle that promised to annihilate not the parasite, but its winged chariot. The chemical was dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. Its insecticidal properties had been discovered just before the war by a Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller, a quiet, methodical man who would win the Nobel Prize for his work. During the war, DDT had proven its worth in stunning fashion, halting a typhus epidemic among Allied troops in Naples by killing the lice that carried it. Now, in peacetime, this persistent, powerful, and remarkably cheap white powder was turned against the Anopheles mosquito. The thinking was audacious, born of post-war hubris. If you have the perfect drug to kill the parasite in the human and the perfect poison to kill the mosquito in the home, why merely control the disease? Why not erase it forever? This was the birth of the dream of eradication. In 1955, the World Health Organization itself a product of that new era of global cooperation, launched the Global Malaria Eradication Programme, the GMEP. It was one of the most ambitious public health initiatives ever conceived. The strategy was simple, elegant, and brutal. It was a military campaign using the language and logistics of war. The plan had 4 phases. First, the attack phase. Teams of sprayers would move through every village, every town, every city in a malarious region. They would enter every single home and spray the interior walls with a coating of DDT. The Anopheles mosquito, a creature of habit, likes to rest on a vertical surface after taking a blood meal to digest. It would land on the wall, its delicate feet would touch the invisible crystals of DDE, and its nervous system would collapse. It would die before the parasites inside it could mature. This tactic, called indoor residual spraying or IRS, wouldn't kill all the mosquitoes, but it didn't have to. It just had to kill the ones that bit humans indoors and lived long enough to pass on the infection. It was a plan to sever the chain of transmission. Simultaneously, anyone with a fever would be treated with chloroquine, clearing the parasite from the human population. After a few years of this relentless assault, you would enter the consolidation phase, where surveillance teams would hunt down the last few remaining cases. Finally, the maintenance phase, a state of eternal vigilance to prevent the parasite from ever returning. And for a time, it worked. It worked with an efficiency that seemed to prove the optimists right. The results were breathtaking. Armies of men with spray tanks on their backs became a common sight across the globe. The sharp chemical smell of DDT was the scent of progress. In country after country, the malaria maps were rolled back. The United States, which still had endemic malaria in its southern states, was declared free of the disease by 1951. In Italy, the ancient scourge of the Pontine Marshes was finally definitively banished. Greece, Sardinia, Cyprus, Taiwan, much of the Caribbean all cleared. In India, the numbers were staggering. Before the programme, the country suffered an estimated 75 million cases a year, with nearly 1 million deaths. By the mid-1960s, cases had dropped to just 50,000. In Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, the results were even more dramatic. From millions of cases, the number fell to just 17. 17. It was a triumph of logistics, chemistry, and sheer willpower. Humanity, it seemed, was winning. A victory over one of its oldest and deadliest enemies was within grasp. But the parasite and its mosquito partner had not been consulted, and they had a vote. The entire grand strategy of the GMAP was built on a few assumptions that proved to be tragically flawed. It assumed that the mosquito would remain vulnerable. It assumed the parasite would remain vulnerable. It assumed that human logistics, funding, and political will would remain constant. It was a plan that demanded perfection in an imperfect world. The first crack in the fortress appeared in the genes of the mosquito. Darwinian selection, which normally works over millennia, was put on a fast track. Within any large population of mosquitoes, a tiny few will have a random genetic mutation that allows them to survive contact with DDT. In a normal environment, this mutation offers no advantage. But in an environment saturated with the insecticide, it is a passport to life. While their susceptible brethren died by the millions, these few resistant individuals survived, and they bred. And their offspring inherited that resistance. Within a few short years, in place after place, the spray teams would arrive, coat the walls with DDT, and nothing would happen. The mosquitoes would land, rest, and fly away perfectly healthy. The miracle poison had become useless. It was evolution, pure and simple, playing out on the mud walls of 1 billion homes. The programme also ran into the messy reality of human society. The GMEP was a top-down, rigidly planned operation that often ignored local realities. In some cultures, people would replaster their walls after the spray teams left, covering the insecticide. Nomadic populations were impossible to track. Political instability and civil wars made spraying operations dangerous or impossible. And then there was simple fatigue. The attack phase required immense, sustained effort. As the disease became rarer, governments and funding agencies began to lose interest. The final crucial stages of consolidation and maintenance were often neglected. The vigilance slipped, and perhaps the most telling flaw, the greatest act of hubris, was the decision made at the very beginning. Sub-Saharan Africa, the continent with the most intense year-round malaria transmission and the most efficient mosquito vectors on the planet, was largely excluded from the global malaria eradication program. It was deemed too difficult, the logistics too complex, the disease too entrenched. The world would deal with the easy parts first and come back for Africa later. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Africa would remain the great unconquered reservoir of the parasite, a fortress from which it could and would re-emerge. By the late 1960s, the dream was dying. The costs were spiralling, the mosquitoes were resistant, and the parasite was proving stubbornly resilient. In 1969, the World Health Assembly quietly, officially abandoned the goal of global eradication. The war had not been won, it had merely been paused. The great advance was over, and a long, painful retreat was about to begin. The collapse of the Great Eradication Campaign was not a gentle decline. It was a fall from a great height. The hope and optimism of the 1950s curdled into the disillusionment and neglect of the 1970s. The world, tired of the fight, largely turned its back on malaria, and in the absence of pressure, the parasite came roaring back. It reconquered its old territories with terrifying speed. In Sri Lanka, where cases had dwindled to a mere handful, a massive epidemic exploded, infecting 500,000 people within a few years. In India, the 50,000 cases of the mid-60s ballooned to over 6 million by the mid-70s. The hard-won gains, purchased with a decade of immense effort and expense, were erased in a biological blink of an eye. The vast infrastructure of surveillance and spraying crumbled. The international funding dried up. For hundreds of millions of people, the brief reprieve was over, and the fevers returned. But this time the parasite was different. It was stronger. It had learned. During the years of the eradication campaign, it had been under immense pressure not just from the attack on its mosquito vector, but from the widespread use of chloroquine. And just as the mosquitoes had evolved resistance to DDT, the parasite was evolving resistance to our best drug. It began quietly in two seemingly unconnected places at the same time in the late 1950s, on the border of Thailand and Cambodia, and deep in a river valley in Colombia. A tiny random mutation in a single gene of the Plasmodium falciparum parasite, a gene that controls a transport pump on its food vacuole, suddenly allowed it to expel chloroquine. It was a simple defense mechanism, but it was enough. Parasites carrying this mutation survived the drug, while their susceptible cousins were wiped out. The resistant strain born in Southeast Asia and South America began to spread. The Vietnam War served as a horrific, unintentional incubator for this new, deadlier form of malaria. The conflict dropped hundreds of thousands of non-immune American soldiers into the jungles of Southeast Asia, one of the world's emerging hotspots for chloroquine resistance. The US military, relying on chloroquine as a prophylactic, inadvertently created the perfect selective pressure cooker. Soldiers took the drug, which killed off any susceptible parasites they contracted, leaving only the resistant ones to thrive and multiply. Troop movements then spread these hardened parasites across the region. The war amplified and accelerated the evolution of a super parasite. In response, the US Army's Walter Reed Army Institute of Research launched a massive drug screening program, a desperate search for a replacement for their failed magic bullet. From this effort would come drugs like mefloquine, a decent but imperfect solution with troubling psychiatric side effects. But the parasite was relentless. As soon as a new drug was deployed, the evolutionary chess match began again. After conquering chloroquine, the parasite developed resistance to the next line of defense, a combination drug called fansidar. And the epicenter of this multi-drug resistance was always the same: the Mekong sub-region of Southeast Asia. The Thai-Cambodian border in particular became a global crucible for parasitic evolution, forging strains of Plasmodium falciparum that could shrug off one drug after another. From there, these resistant genes, carried in the blood of travellers, migrants, and soldiers, began their slow march across the globe, spreading into India and eventually into Africa. The period from the 1970s through the early 1990s represents a dark age in the history of malaria control. The tools were broken, the funding was gone, the political will had evaporated. In sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, the situation was catastrophic. Millions died, the vast majority of them children under the age of 5, their small bodies overwhelmed by a disease that had become once again largely untreatable. Malaria became a poverty trap, locking nations in a cycle of sickness and economic stagnation. It was a silent, ongoing humanitarian disaster, happening largely out of sight of the developed world. The search for a new weapon became a matter of supreme urgency, and the answer, when it came not from a Western pharmaceutical giant, but from a secret military project in communist China. In the 1960s, as the Vietnam War raged, Chairman Mao Zedong initiated Project 523. The goal was to find a new anti-malarial to help their North Vietnamese allies, who were suffering terribly from the new resistant strains. The project involved hundreds of scientists across China. One of them was a woman named Tu Yu. She and her team were tasked with combing through ancient texts on traditional Chinese medicine. In a 4th century text called Emergency Prescriptions Kept Up One's Sleeve, she found a tantalizing reference. It described using sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, to treat fevers. Crucially, the text mentioned soaking the herb in cold water and wringing it out, not boiling it, which was the typical way of preparing herbal remedies. Tu Yu realised that heat might be destroying the active ingredient. Her team developed a cold ether extraction method, and in 1971 they successfully isolated the active compound. They called it artemisinin. It was unlike any other anti-malarial. It was incredibly fast-acting, clearing parasites from the blood with stunning speed. It was a completely new class of drug with a completely different mechanism of action. For years, the discovery remained a state secret in China, published only in Chinese journals, but eventually the news trickled out to the rest of the world. It was a lifeline. By the late 1990s, the global health community, shocked back into action by the sheer scale of the resurgent crisis, recognised artemisinin as the breakthrough they had been desperately seeking. But they had learned a bitter lesson from the history of chloroquine. To deploy artemisinin as a single drug, a monotherapy, would be to condemn it to a short life. The parasite would inevitably develop resistance to it as well. A new strategy was needed. Borrowing from the playbooks used to fight HIV and tuberculosis, scientists championed a new approach: combination therapy. The idea was to hit the parasite with 2 weapons at once. Pair the fast-acting artemisinin with a second, longer-lasting partner drug that has a different mechanism of action. This multi-pronged attack makes it exponentially harder for the parasite to develop resistance. It would need to develop 2 separate mutations simultaneously, a far more unlikely event. These new drugs, known as artemisinin-based combination therapies, or ACEs, became the new gold standard of care. This marked the beginning of the modern era of malaria control, an era stripped of the hubris of eradication, defined by a more sober and complex strategy of sustained control. It is an era of new tools, new drugs, insecticide-treated bed nets, rapid diagnostic tests, but also by a deep and humbling respect for the enemy, a respect for a simple single-celled organism that has outwitted our best minds, survived our strongest poisons, and continues to wage its ancient silent war in the quiet landscape of the human bloodstream. The long war against malaria was about to enter a new, and perhaps its strangest theatre. The battlefield was no longer just the swamp, the rice paddy, or the human bloodstream. It was now a space of almost infinite smallness, a realm of nucleic acids and base pairs, of adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. The conflict had moved inward, from the macroscopic world of DDT spray guns and quinine plantations to the quiet, humming, refrigerated world of the molecular biology laboratory. For centuries, Humanity had fought the parasite and its vector as one might fight a ghost, swinging at shadows, treating the fevers, but never truly seeing the enemy's face, never understanding the intricate machinery that made it so lethally efficient. By the late 20th century, that was changing. The tools of a genetic revolution, forged in the study of fruit flies and gut bacteria, were finally being turned upon this ancient adversary. The great project, the grand strategic objective, was to read the enemy's playbook from cover to cover. This meant sequencing the complete genome of both the killer and its accomplice, Plasmodium falciparum and the mosquito Anopheles gambiae. It was a task of immense complexity. The parasite, for all its single-celled simplicity, possessed a surprisingly labyrinthine genetic code, one that had been honed by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to do just a few things exceptionally well: invade, replicate, and hide. It was a minimalist masterpiece of survival. The project was a global undertaking, a consortium of brilliant minds and powerful machines stretching from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute near Cambridge in the UK to the Institute for Genomic Research, or TIGA, in Maryland. For years, through the 1990s and into the new millennium, the work continued. It was a slow, painstaking process of shattering the DNA into millions of tiny, manageable fragments, using automated sequencers to read the chemical letters of each piece, and then relying on supercomputers to solve the most complex jigsaw puzzle in the history of medicine, stitching it all back together in the correct order. Finally, in the autumn of 2002, the news broke. 2 landmark papers were published, almost side by side, in the journal Nature. The book of Plasmodium was open. Its 23 million letters, spread across 14 chromosomes, were laid bare. And in a companion paper, the 278 million letters of the Anopheles gambiae genome were also revealed. For the first time, researchers could look directly at the blueprints. It was a moment of profound revelation, like finding the complete architectural plans for an enemy fortress you'd been besieging for millennia. Suddenly, you could see where the load-bearing walls were. You could see the secret passages. You could see the vulnerabilities. The genome of Plasmodium falciparum was, to put it mildly, a strange beast. It was extraordinarily rich in 2 letters, A and T, a chemical quirk that made it difficult to study and copy in the lab. It was packed with genes dedicated to one of the parasite's most cunning tricks, antigenic variation. Researchers could now see the vast library of genes, the VAR gene family, that the parasite used to constantly change the proteins on the surface of infected red blood cells. This was the molecular basis for its masterful evasion of the human immune system. It was why a person could get malaria over and over again. The parasite simply changed its coat, presenting a new face to the body's defenders with each subsequent wave of infection. The genome also revealed the secrets of its complex life cycle, pinpointing the specific genes that were switched on or off as it migrated from the mosquito's gut to its salivary glands, and from a human's liver to their blood. Each stage was a precise, genetically choreographed performance. At the same time, the mosquito's genome offered its own set of secrets. Scientists could now identify the genes responsible for its incredibly sensitive sense of smell, the olfactory receptors that allowed a female Anopheles to detect the carbon dioxide, the lactic acid, and the other subtle chemical cues of a warm-blooded meal from meters away. They could see the genes that coded for the enzymes it used to detoxify insecticides, the very mechanisms that had allowed it to develop resistance to DT and the pyrethroids that followed. It was a complete wiring diagram for the world's most dangerous animal. This wasn't just academic, this was actionable intelligence. Knowing the parasite's genetic playbook allowed for the development of far smarter weapons. Instead of randomly screening thousands of chemical compounds to see if any happened to kill the parasite, the old brute force method, scientists could now practice rational drug design. They could identify a protein essential for the parasite's survival, one with a unique structure not found in humans, and then design a molecule specifically to clog it up, to disable a single critical piece of its machinery. This new knowledge also revolutionized diagnostics. For a century, the gold standard for diagnosing malaria had been a trained technician staring through a microscope at a drop of blood on a glass slide, hunting for the faint crescent-shaped or ring-shaped shadows of the parasite. It was effective, but it was slow, labour-intensive, and required a well-equipped lab and a skilled eye. The genomic age gave birth to the Rapid Diagnostic Test, or RDT. These were small plastic cassettes, wonderfully simple to use. A drop of blood, a few drops of a buffer solution, and within 15 minutes a coloured line would appear if parasite-specific proteins first identified through genetic sequencing, were present. It was a medical miracle in a tiny package, allowing a healthcare worker in a remote village, miles from any laboratory, to make a confident diagnosis and begin treatment immediately. The scale of this was transformative. It meant fevers could be properly diagnosed, reserving powerful anti-malarial drugs for those who truly needed them. And of course there was the ultimate prize, a vaccine. The parasite's genetic secrets offered up a tantalizing menu of potential targets. Scientists could now isolate the genes for the proteins the parasite uses to burrow into liver cells, or the ones it uses to invade red blood cells. They could manufacture these proteins in the lab and use them to train the human immune system to recognize and attack the invader on sight. The path would be long, frustrating, and littered with failures. The parasite, after all, was an expert in evasion. But for the first time, the path was at least visible. The code had been cracked. The ghost now had a face, a name, and a detailed anatomical chart. The hunt could begin in earnest. This flood of genetic information did not stay confined to the laboratory. It flowed outwards, fundamentally reshaping the global strategy for malaria control. The old, often desperate campaigns of the 20th century gave way to a more sophisticated, multi-pronged assault in the 21st, powered by new tools and a new understanding of the enemy. The most visible symbol of this modern war was a simple, unassuming object, the insecticide-treated bed net. The concept was not new, but its application was about to be scaled up to a degree that was previously unimaginable. The logic was beautifully simple. The Anopheles gambiae mosquito is a creature of habit. It hunts primarily at night, between dusk and dawn, when its victims are asleep and vulnerable. A physical barrier, a net, could protect them. But a net treated with a long-lasting, slow-release insecticide, typically a pyrethroid, did more. It was not just a shield, it was a trap. It was a passive killing device. A mosquito, drawn by the scent of a sleeper, would land on the net, absorb a lethal dose of the insecticide through its feet, and die before it could bite or transmit the parasite to anyone else. Beginning in the early 2000s, organisations like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, the President's Malaria Initiative launched by the US government, and the World Health Organization orchestrated a logistical operation of staggering proportions. The goal was universal coverage in endemic areas. This meant not just giving one net to a village, but ensuring that every single person, every man, woman and child slept under one every single night. It was a campaign fought not with soldiers, but with public health workers, with shipping containers, with vast supply chains, and with countless community education programs. Hundreds of millions of nets, bundled in plastic, were shipped to ports, loaded onto trucks, driven down crumbling roads, and sometimes carried on foot or by canoe to the most remote corners of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. The impact was dramatic and immediate. In country after country where net coverage became widespread, malaria cases and childhood mortality rates plummeted. It was arguably one of the single most effective public health interventions in human history. Of course the enemy adapted. Mosquitoes began to develop resistance to the pyrethroids used on the nets, their genomes shuffling and evolving to produce more of the detoxifying enzymes that could break down the poison. Some even began to change their behaviour, biting earlier in the evening or outdoors, avoiding the nightly trap altogether. The arms race continued. Alongside the nets came a revolution in treatment. The era of chloroquine, the wonder drug that had lost its magic, was over. In its place came the artemisinin-based combination therapies, or ACTs. The genius of this approach, born from the hard-won lesson of resistance, was the combination. Artemisinin, the powerful compound derived from the sweet wormwood plant, was a brutally fast and effective parasite killer. It cleared the bulk of the plasmodium from a patient's bloodstream in a matter of hours, but it acted so quickly that it was also flushed from the body quickly, potentially leaving a few hardy parasite survivors behind. If used alone, these survivors would be the ones with some nascent resistance, and they would be left to multiply, creating a new, drug-resistant strain. The solution was to pair artemisinin with a second, longer-lasting partner drug from a different chemical class. The artemisinin would deliver the rapid knockdown blow, and its partner would linger in the bloodstream for days, mopping up any stragglers. Hitting the parasite with two different mechanisms at once made it exponentially harder for resistance to develop. ACTs became the global standard of care, and, like the bed nets, their rollout was a massive logistical feat, saving millions of lives. But even as these powerful existing tools were being deployed on a massive scale, scientists in the quiet of their labs were dreaming up strategies that sounded like science fiction. They were no longer content to just kill the mosquito or medicate the human. They were now contemplating a far more audacious goal: to re-engineer the mosquito itself. The key was a revolutionary gene editing technology known as CRISPR-Cas9. It was a molecular scalpel of incredible precision, allowing scientists to cut and paste DNA with an ease that was previously unthinkable, and it opened the door to a concept known as a gene drive. Normally, a genetic trait has a 50-50 chance of being passed from a parent to its offspring. A gene drive changes the rules of heredity. It's a selfish genetic element that ensures it gets passed on to almost all offspring, not just half. This means a new trait can be driven through an entire population of animals with an astonishing speed. The idea was to use CRISPR to insert a gene drive into male mosquitoes in the lab. This drive could carry a cargo, a bit of genetic code with a specific purpose. One idea was a male-only drive. It would cause all offspring to be male, or make females sterile. Released into the wild, these edited mosquitoes would mate, and within a handful of generations the local mosquito population would crash, as there would be no more females to lay eggs. Another, perhaps more subtle approach was to give the mosquitoes a gene that made them immune to the malaria parasite itself. They could still bite people, but they would be incapable of transmitting the disease. They would be transformed from vectors into evolutionary dead ends for plasmodium. These were ideas of breathtaking power and consequence. They offered the possibility of eradicating the vector from a specific region without spraying a single drop of insecticide. But they also raised profound ethical and ecological questions. What were the unforeseen consequences of permanently altering an entire species? What if the edited gene jumped to another non-target mosquito species? The conversations moved from the lab to the meeting rooms of ethicists, ecologists, and regulators. The power was there. The wisdom to use it was still being debated. While some looked to remake the mosquito, others focused on the long and frustrating quest for a human vaccine. Decades of work guided by the new genomic knowledge finally began to bear fruit. The first to cross the finish line was a vaccine with a rather unpoetic name, RTS. S, later branded as Mosquirix. It targeted the parasite at its earliest stage, just after a person is bitten, when the sporozoites are travelling from the skin to the liver. The goal was to stop the infection before it could even begin. After years of clinical trials, the results were promising but not perfect. The vaccine didn't provide complete immunity. It reduced the number of clinical malaria cases in young children by about 30 to 40%. This was far from the near-total protection offered by vaccines for diseases like measles or polio, and its effectiveness waned over time. To some, it was a disappointment. But to public health officials on the front lines, a tool that could prevent a third of malaria cases in the most vulnerable children was not a failure. It was a breakthrough. In 2010, Landmark pilot programs began in Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi, integrating the new vaccine into their routine childhood immunization schedules. It was another new weapon in the arsenal, not a silver bullet that would end the war overnight, but a vital piece of armour for the children who bore the heaviest burden of the disease. It was a beginning. A new era of malarial immunology was dawning, with other, even more effective vaccines like RT1 Matrix M following closely behind. The battle was no longer just about nets and drugs. It was now a fight fought with our own engineered immune systems, and so the long, grinding war continues into the 21st century, a complex mosaic of remarkable progress and persistent, shadowy threats. If you were to look at a graph of malaria mortality since the year 2000, you would see a line moving in a direction that represents one of the greatest public health triumphs of our time. It is a steep and steady decline. The coordinated global effort, the hundreds of millions of bed nets, the hundreds of millions of courses of ACTs, the improved diagnostics, the targeted spraying has had a real, measurable and magnificent impact. An estimated 2 billion cases have been averted. More than 11 million lives, mostly the lives of small children in Africa, have been saved. These are not just statistics. They are quiet villages no longer hollowed out by grief. They are children who survived their 5th birthday, who grew up, went to school, and had families of their own. It is a victory written in the currency of ordinary life. Countries that were once crippled by the disease have now eliminated it entirely. Sri Lanka was declared malaria-free in 2016. China, a nation that once suffered 30 million cases a year, was certified free of the parasite in 21. The map of malaria is, slowly but surely, shrinking. Yet the parasite is an ancient and resilient foe. It does not surrender territory willingly, and the progress that has been so hard won is fragile. The funding that underpins this global effort, flowing from wealthier nations and philanthropic foundations, is immense, but it is not infinite. When economic recessions hit, or when new terrifying pandemics like COVID-19 emerge, priorities shift. Attention wanes, budgets are cut, and malaria is a fire that is never truly extinguished. It is merely suppressed. If you stop pressing down on it, the embers will glow again, and the flames will return with shocking speed. In recent years, that steady downward line on the graph has begun to flatten. In some places, it has even begun to tick upwards again. Progress has stalled. Looming over this entire struggle is the immense, unpredictable variable of a warming planet. Malaria has always been a disease of climate. The parasite needs warmth to develop inside the mosquito, and the mosquito needs water to breed. Climate change is rewriting these fundamental rules. As temperatures rise, the geographic ceiling for malaria transmission is creeping higher up mountainsides in Africa and South America, into highlands that were once too cool for the parasite to thrive. Changing rainfall patterns, more intense, erratic storms and longer droughts can create new and unpredictable breeding grounds for mosquitoes. A longer rainy season means a longer transmission season. The slow, relentless pressure of a changing climate threatens to undo decades of progress, introducing the parasite to naive populations with no acquired immunity, potentially expanding the edges of the malaria map for the first time in a century. Human movement also complicates the picture. In a world of unprecedented mobility, a parasite can travel as easily as a person. A migrant worker, a refugee fleeing conflict, or a tourist can carry dormant liver-stage parasites from an endemic area to one where malaria has been eliminated, but where the Anopheles mosquitoes are still present. This is how the disease is reintroduced. This is how the fire is rekindled. It only takes one imported case to spark a local outbreak, requiring a rapid and effective public health response to contain it before it can spread. Urbanisation presents its own paradox. While cities often have better access to healthcare, the poorly planned, sprawling, informal settlements on their outskirts can create perfect new habitats for different species of anopheles, mosquitoes, some of which are adept at breeding in the small sunlit pools of water common in construction sites and urban waste grounds. And beneath all of this lies the parasite's greatest weapon, its oldest and most reliable strategy, evolution. The arms race never stops. In the greater Mekong sub-region of Southeast Asia, a hotbed of drug resistance, strains of Plasmodium falciparum have emerged that show a worrying tolerance to artemisinin. The knockdown blows becoming less effective. The partner drugs are now under immense pressure, and resistance to them is growing too. Scientists are racing to develop new compounds, but the parasite always seems to be just one step behind. At the same time, mosquitoes continue to evolve resistance to the insecticides used in bed nets and indoor spraying. It is a constant evolutionary chess game played out across entire continents. We develop a new chemical, the mosquito evolves a new enzyme to defeat it. We switch to a different chemical, the mosquito develops a different mechanism. The ultimate vision, the dream that has animated this long struggle since the days of Ronald Ross, is not just control, but eradication. The complete and permanent removal of the parasite from the human population, as was accomplished with smallpox. It remains a distant, but not an impossible goal. Getting there will require not just the tools we have now, but the tools that are still on the horizon. It will demand the full deployment of the new vaccines. It may require the careful, considered use of revolutionary technologies like gene drives. Above all, it will require something that has often been the scarcest resource of all: sustained political will and the long-term, uninterrupted funding to see the job through to the very end. It will mean strengthening healthcare systems in the poorest parts of the world so that every fever can be tested, every case can be treated, and every outbreak can be tracked. The story of humanity and malaria is a story of a shadow that has walked alongside us for our entire history. It is a story of a parasite that has shaped our genomes, brought down empires, and dictated the course of human settlement. But it is also a story of our own species' remarkable ingenuity, our stubbornness, our curiosity, and our capacity for collective action. From the first person who chewed on the bitter bark of a cinchona tree, to the scientists who painstakingly decoded its genome, to the healthcare worker on a motorbike delivering bed nets to a remote village, the fight has been a testament to our refusal to accept this disease as a fact of life. The battle is not over. The ancient parasite is weakened, it is cornered in many places, but it endures. And so we too must endure. The long, slow, difficult work continues, carried out in the quiet hum of the laboratory and the profound quiet of a family sleeping safely for another night under the simple, elegant protection of a net.